Operation Clean Sweep. The makeshift outpost on the edge of the ruins buzzed with activity, but the atmosphere was far from ordinary. A heavy tension hung in the air, punctuated by the low hum of distant machinery and the occasional crackle of static over the comms. The sun cast a long shadow from the spine over the encampment, its shadow stretching over the desolate landscape like an omen. Somewhere out there, the whistlers lurked, unseen but ever present. In a dimly lit briefing room, Kade stood alone at the edge of a tactical holomap, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The map projected the targeted area, a grid of derelict industrial buildings, wide-open spaces, and civilian zones perilously close to the bug-infested ruins. His eyes traced the lines of the plan, searching for weaknesses. Operation Clean Sweep. A bit on the nose, isn't it? Do you really think we can take them all out? Said Dr. Martel, stepping into the room. Her voice was mostly calm, but a slight tremor betrayed her underlying nerves. She placed a small device on the table, a rough, makeshift contraption that pulsed faintly with a greenish glow. The central component was no bigger than a thermos, but was easily the most valuable piece of equipment Kade had ever seen. "I'm not sure," he replied. "We have a good setup, but supplies are a bit light, but that's always a struggle." Martel, dressed in a practical uniform instead of her usual lab coat, met Kade's gaze. "I just finished the testing and it looks like this thing should work. It's designed to mimic the Whistler's bioelectric signals. It should lure them out so we can kill everything in that specific area. But," she hesitated, "there's a risk." "Let me guess," Kade said, his tone edged with skepticism. "The signal might draw some from other areas?" Martel nodded. "We tried to calculate how many bugs we think are in the specific area, but we obviously can't know for sure. The beacon's range is amplified by the alien biofluids we incorporated. It's untested in the field, but it's the only way to lure them out before they reach the civilian zone." Kade's jaw tightened, his mind calculating probabilities. "And if it doesn't work?" "We're bored," Donovan said, entering the room and leaning casually against the wall. His laid-back demeanor was in stark contrast to the somber mood of the conversation, but his sharp eyes betrayed his attentiveness. "Even if it does work, we'll still need to move fast. Bugs don't play by our rules." Kade shot him a look. "We've all fought whistlers before, we know." "Yeah, but without Jansen's help?" Kade scowled. Jansen was one of their best, but he was still recovering. "I'm just saying," Donovan said, "mobility is key. We stick too close to that fancy gadget and they'll surround us before we know what hit us. Let my squad keep things loose." "And waste ammunition while leaving the beacon exposed?" Kade countered. "We need to hold our ground, protect the device, thin their numbers where they're strongest." "That's one way to do it," Donovan said with a shrug. "But when has a Whistler fight ever gone the way we planned?" Martel stepped in, her tone firm. "This isn't about who's right. The beacon is our priority. We're no closer to understanding them than we were before. It's just a test, sure, but of everything we've learned so far..." Kade nodded reluctantly, turning his focus back to the map. "Fine, but we do this my way. Defensive positions, choke points, conserve firepower." "Sure thing." Donovan pushed off the wall and tipped an imaginary hat. "But don't say I didn't warn you when things get messy." Martel cleared her throat, drawing their attention back to the table. "The mission isn't just about defense or offense, it's about survival. And if the beacon works, if we can pull this off, it might be the first step to turning the tide against them." Kade straightened, his voice low but resolute. "Then let's make sure we don't lose that step." The three exited the briefing room, stepping into the dim corridors of the base. Outside, the whine of dropship engines pierced the air, coming in for a supply drop. The mission was clear, but the weight of the unknown pressed on all of them. Somewhere in the ruins the whistlers waited, their eerie sounds a haunting promise of the fight ahead. The ruins of the industrial complex stretched out in jagged silhouettes against the gray horizon. Rusted beams jutted skyward like skeletal remains, and the air carried the scent of decay, The sound of boots on rubble echoed as the two squads moved into position, their movements purposeful but subdued. There wasn't enough ammunition for a drawn-out battle, and everyone knew it. Supplies of all kinds were very limited. Kade directed his team with precision, placing soldiers behind hastily constructed barricades made from debris and broken machinery. "Keep the sightlines clear," he ordered, his voice clipped. "Anything gets through, we're in trouble." Across the zone, Donovan's squad worked the perimeter. Their approach was looser, more flexible, as they scouted the edges for hidden threats. Donovan himself leaned casually against a half-collapsed wall, scanning the ruins with a practiced eye. "All quiet for now," he muttered to his second-in-command. In the center of the zone, Dr. Martel knelt by the beacon. The device looked out of place among the rubble, a rough assembly of scavenged parts and alien biofluids encased in a reinforced housing. Its faint glow cast shifting shadows on her face as she worked. She connected the beacon to a power supply, her movements quick but deliberate. "How's it coming?" Kade asked, approaching her position. Martel didn't look up. "Almost there. The amplifiers need to sync with the power draw." She glanced at him briefly, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. "Once it's active, we'll have a short window to see if it works. The signal doesn't stay consistent for very long. And if it doesn't work right away, then, like Donovan said before, it'll be a very quiet day." The beacon powered up with a faint hum that deepened into a resonating low-frequency pulse. The greenish glow intensified, spilling across the rubble-strewn ground. Static crackled through the soldiers' comms, cutting off mid-transmission. "Comms are going out," one of Kade's men reported. "Stick to hand signals," Kade ordered, his voice rising over the hum. "Stay sharp." Martel adjusted the device, her fingers hovering over controls. The biofluids amplified the signal's range beyond what we would normally expect from this amount of power. The disruption is a side effect. It means the beacon is working. Around them, the air seemed to shift. The oppressive silence of the ruins was broken by an eerie whistling that floated through the debris, faint at first but growing louder. Kade raised his rifle, scanning the shadows. His soldiers followed suit, their grips tightening on their weapons. The first whistler appeared, emerging cautiously from a collapsed tunnel. Its glossy beetle-like shell reflected the beacon's glow, and its scalpel-like limbs scraped against the rubble. Another followed, then another, their triangular heads tilting, as if analyzing the strange signal. "Open fire," Kade commanded. The soldiers dispatched the first wave with quick, controlled bursts. The creatures fell, legs shattered, their bioluminescent blood pooling on the ground. That would only slow them, however, and they had to stay on alert as the whistlers slowly dragged themselves across the field. For a moment, the beacon's hum was the only sound. "Well," Donovan said from the perimeter, his voice faint due to the distance. "Looks like your gizmo works, Doc." Martel didn't reply. Her attention was fixed on the datapad in her hand, monitoring readings from the beacon. "They're behaving differently," she muttered. "These readings are way off." The whistling grew louder. More whistlers emerged, their movements faster, more aggressive. They didn't approach in a straight line but spread out, probing the defenses. One scaled a wall, only to be shot down before it could leap. Another darted toward the beacon, its movements erratic. "Hold your fire until they're closer," Kade ordered. "We can't afford to waste ammo." The soldiers adjusted, aiming more carefully. Donovan's team shifted positions, picking off bugs trying to flank the perimeter. "They're testing us," Donovan said, his voice grim. "Smart." Martel crouched lower behind the beacon, her eyes fixed on the readings. "Yeah, it isn't random for sure," she said. "They're reacting to the signal, but it's not like last time. She hesitated, as if reluctant to voice her thoughts. "It's a very different signal now." Kade didn't reply, his focus on the advancing swarm. The ammunition count was dropping too quickly, and according to the sensors, they hadn't even hit the main wave yet. A soldier tossed a grenade, the explosion sending a cluster of bugs flying. The brief reprieve was welcome, but explosives were hard to come by. Martel glanced up sharply. "Can we keep this up?" she asked. "If we burn through our resources now." "We won't make it to later, Doc," Donovan interrupted, firing another shot. "We've got what we've got. We just need to be careful." The beacon's glow flickered momentarily, and the whistlers hesitated before surging forward again. Martel's datapad buzzed with alerts, her expression tightening. "There's something wrong. The signal, it's stronger than we anticipated. More are coming." "How many more?" Kade asked, his voice tense. Martel didn't answer immediately. When she looked up, her face was pale. "Too many." The whistling swelled into a cacophony, echoing through the ruins. From every direction, shadows moved, closing in. Kade's grip on his rifle tightened as he shouted to his team, "Hold the line! They're coming!" The whistling rose to a deafening crescendo, the alien symphony echoing off the skeletal remains of the industrial complex. Kade felt the weight of it vibrating in his chest, an oppressive pressure that sent shivers down his spine. The ruins around them seemed alive, the shadows shifting with the movement of countless legs and scalpel-like limbs. "They're everywhere," Kade said, his voice steady despite the cold dread clawing at his gut. He raised his rifle, scanning the flickering light of the beacon. "Hold your positions. Make every shot count." The next wave came like a ripple, a dozen glossy black forms skittering out of the darkness. Their triangular heads tilted in unison as if assessing the defenses. Then they surged forward, a coordinated blur of lethal precision. The soldiers opened fire, the crack of rifles blending with the low hum of the beacon. Whistlers fell, their glowing blood spraying across the rubble, but more came, undeterred. From the perimeter, Donovan's voice crackled over the patchy comms. "We've got movement on the north side, fast movers. They're flanking." Kade turned, cursing under his breath. "Shift fire to the north. Donovan, hold them off as long as you can." Donovan's squad darted through the rubble, using hit-and-run tactics to slow the advancing swarm. Grenades exploded in flashes of light, momentarily halting the whistlers but doing little to thin their numbers. "These things are smarter than last time," Donovan muttered, snapping off a shot that dropped a bug mid-leap. "They know what we can do now." The bugs didn't just charge blindly, even though they came in large numbers. They probed the defenses, testing weak points. One scaled a metal barricade, its limbs clicking as it dismantled the structure with horrifying precision. "Martel!" Kade shouted, firing at the bug. "They're getting too close to the beacon. We need to turn that thing off." "I know," Martel yelled back, frantically trying to manage the beacon's output. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she feverishly used the controls. The soldiers adjusted their tactics, shifting fire to cover the beacon. The bugs responded in kind, their movements growing faster and more coordinated. They scaled walls, burned out cars and barricades, attacking from above and below, forcing the soldiers to adapt on the fly. "They're dismantling us," one soldier shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "Hold position," Kade barked. "We're not done yet." Kade hesitated, his gaze sweeping the battlefield. The barricades were crumbling, the soldiers stretched thin. Ammunition was running low, and the swarm showed no signs of slowing. "Do it already," he said finally, his voice tight. "Shut it down." None of the adjustments had worked. Martel pulled the power cable, but the glow stayed steady. Her eyes widened in fear. "It's powering itself now. I didn't think it would have that much power left. Nothing in the tests showed it could." For a moment, the bugs hesitated. The whistling softened, and Kade dared to hope they'd stop. The silence was shattered as the swarm surged forward with renewed fury. The whistlers didn't retreat. Instead, their movements grew even more erratic and aggressive, as if enraged by the change of power to the unit. They attacked indiscriminately, their scalpel-like limbs slicing through anything in their path. "What the?" Donovan shouted, firing at a bug that lunged toward his position. "How is this still happening?" The soldiers fell back, regrouping around the remnants of their defenses. Kade's voice cut through the chaos. "Focus fire! Protect Martel and the wounded! Fall back to my location and evacuate!" Donovan's squad moved to cover the flanks, their hit-and-run tactics replaced by a desperate attempt to hold the line. "We're out of grenades," one of Donovan's men called out. "Then use what you've got left," Donovan replied, his tone grim. The swarm pressed closer, their whistles reverberating like a relentless, mocking chorus. Kade aimed carefully, picking off one bug after another, but it felt like trying to empty an ocean with a bucket. Around him, soldiers shouted commands, their voices tinged with exhaustion and fear. Everywhere, the partial remains of whistlers crawled toward them on broken limbs. The realization hit Kade like a punch to the gut. The beacon hadn't worked as intended. Instead of controlling the bugs, it had unleashed chaos. He fired another burst, his mind racing. "We can't hold this position," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Martel looked up, her face pale. "What do we do?" Kade's jaw tightened. "We fall back to the ship. Donovan, get your squad ready to cover the retreat." "On it," Donovan replied, his voice grim but steady. As the swarm closed in, Kade gave the order. "Fall back, now!" The soldiers moved quickly, dragging the wounded and covering each other as they retreated into the shadows of the ruins. Behind them, the whistlers swarmed over the remnants of their defenses, their eerie sound echoing into the night. The mission was on the verge of failure, and the nightmare was just beginning. The battlefield dissolved into chaos as the whistlers pressed their advantage. The bugs' movements became erratic, their attacks striking at random. They no longer probed the defenses, they swarmed with reckless ferocity, flooding through gaps in the barricades and scaling walls like a tide of razor-edged shadows. Kade's enhanced senses inside his power armor picked up every detail, the hiss of bioluminescent blood sizzling on metal, the sharp staccato of rifle fire, and the shrill whistles of the swarm, growing ever closer. His HUD flickered as static from the bug's bioelectric interference disrupted targeting systems. "You're everywhere," a soldier shouted. "Keep it together," Kade ordered, his voice amplified through his armor's external speakers. He fired in controlled bursts, each shot precise and lethal. A bug lunged for him, its scalpel-like limbs flashing. Kade sidestepped with an agility that belied his armored bulk, bringing his rifle up and blowing the creature apart mid-air. The whistlers attacked from all directions, their movements a nightmare of unpredictable speed and precision. One scaled a wall and dropped onto a soldier, its claws questing under the bottom lip of his helmet before plunging in. Another darted under a partial barricade, slicing at the vulnerable knee joints of fleeing soldiers. Kade's HUD lit up with damage reports from across the squad. "Fall back to this location," he ordered, marking a spot on the squad's HUD map. Donovan's squad was a blur of motion on the perimeter, their power armor amplifying their speed and strength. Donovan leapt onto a low rooftop, his enhanced leg servos propelling him effortlessly. From his vantage point, he sprayed suppressing fire, his targeting systems compensating for the bug's erratic movements. "We're thinning 'em out," he called over the comms, "but not fast enough." "They don't need strategy anymore," Martel shouted from her position behind a rusted-out car. She frantically dismantled the beacon's housing, pulling out its glowing core. "They're running on pure aggression. Just let me get the data." Kade aimed at a bug charging toward Martel, its limbs raised to strike. He dropped it with 3 shots, the recoil absorbed by his armor's stabilizers. Martel stared at the beacon in frustration, then, heaving the beacon over her head, smashed it into the ground, spraying fluid everywhere. Something detonated nearby, sending a cluster of whistlers flying, their bioluminescent blood painting the walls. "That was my last one," a soldier yelled, his tone laced with desperation. Now both squads were out of grenades. Kade's mind raced. Ammunition counters on his HUD showed critical levels across the squad. "Conserve your rounds," he ordered. "Focus fire on the ones closest to the wounded." Donovan's voice crackled through the comms, distorted by interference. "We're out of toys too, gonna get real personal soon." Kade gritted his teeth, shifting his strategy. "Donovan, keep moving, draw them away from the center." "On it." Donovan leapt from his rooftop perch, landing with a thud that cracked the pavement. His squad followed, their enhanced strength allowing them to push through rubble and lead the whistlers on a chaotic chase. They fired in short bursts, targeting legs and joints to slow the bugs down. Meanwhile, Kade's squad formed a defensive ring around Martel. A whistler lunged at him, its limbs raised high. Kade pivoted, grabbing it mid-air with enhanced reflexes. The servos in his armor groaned as he crushed the creature, its glowing blood seeping between his metal-gloved fingers. He tossed the remains aside, already aiming at the next threat. "Done," Martel shouted, holding up the salvage data chip. "I've got it!" Kade scanned the battlefield. The barricades were mostly gone, the air thick with smoke and static. The whistlers were swarming in greater numbers than ever, their relentless whistles clawing at his sanity. "Time to leave," he said, switching to the open channel. "We're falling back again. Donovan, you and your team cover our retreat." Kade motioned to his squad. "Move, protect the wounded and Martel." The soldiers fell back in tight formation, their power armor shielding the injured as they pushed through the ruins. Kade stayed near the rear, his rifle barking as he cut down any bug that got too close. The enhanced strength of their armor allowed them to shove debris aside, clearing a path for the team. Donovan and his squad held their ground, fighting like cornered animals. One of his soldiers grabbed a whistler by the leg, using his strength to slam it into another bug with bone-shattering force. Donovan fired into the swarm with unrelenting focus, his grin replaced by a grim determination. "Don't stop until they're clear," he shouted, his voice raw. The retreat was brutal. The whistlers pursued relentlessly, their whistles echoing through the ruins as if mocking the soldiers' efforts. Kade's squad reached the extraction point, where they hastily set up a defensive position. "Donovan, we're in position," Kade called through the comms. "Copy that," Donovan's voice was strained but steady. "On our way." Moments later, Donovan's team broke through the swarm, battered but alive. Kade and his squad provided covering fire, their remaining ammunition barely enough to hold the whistlers at bay. The calls grew fainter, but Kade knew it wasn't over. He turned to Martel, who clutched the data core like a lifeline. "Let's hope your data's worth it," he said, his voice heavy. Martel nodded, her expression grim. "It better be." The remains of the beacon lay abandoned, its faint, sputtering glow casting long, flickering shadows over the ruins. The soldiers didn't look back as they ran, their footfalls muffled by the oppressive weight of the whistler's relentless chorus. The sound followed them, an alien dirge that echoed through the crumbling industrial complex. "Move faster," Kade shouted, his voice amplified through his armor's external speakers. His squad pushed forward, hauling the wounded while keeping their rifles trained on the shadows that seemed to shift and crawl around them. Martel clutched the salvaged core of the beacon, her breaths ragged but determined. "They're still following us," she managed, glancing over her shoulder. "Yeah, I noticed," Donovan called, as he fired at a whistler darting through the rubble. The creature fell, its bioluminescent blood glowing faintly in the darkness. "Keep your head down, Doc." The soldiers weaved through the ruins, their power armor amplifying their speed and strength, but the whistlers were just as fast. They surged through the debris with terrifying agility, their scalpel-like limbs scraping against stone and metal as they closed the distance. "They're gaining," a soldier shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "Suppressing fire," Kade ordered. The squad halted briefly, their rifles lighting up the dark as they laid down a withering barrage. Whistlers fell, their bodies twitching as their gleaming blood soaked the ground. But for every one that dropped, 2 more seemed to take its place. The soldiers reached the edge of the industrial zone, the looming silhouette of an abandoned warehouse offering a momentary reprieve. Kade motioned toward the structure. "Inside! Now!" They poured into the building, the heavy clang of boots reverberating through the cavernous space. Donovan's squad brought up the rear, firing in short, controlled bursts to slow the advancing swarm. As soon as the last soldier was inside, they slammed the doors shut and barricaded them with whatever they could find. Metal beams, crates, and fallen debris. "Seal that gap," Kade barked, pointing to a shattered window. 2 soldiers moved to cover it, their weapons at the ready. The whistles grew louder, more insistent. The bugs slammed against the barricades, their scalpel limbs slicing through gaps and crevices. A soldier let out a strangled cry as a whistler's clawed appendage darted through a hole, grazing his arm before being pulled back. "Keep them out!" Kade yelled, his rifle aimed at the nearest breach. He fired, the report of his weapon echoing in the enclosed space. The bug fell, twitching. The soldiers formed a defensive perimeter, their movements precise despite the chaos. Kade and Donovan worked in unison, coordinating the defense. "Focus fire on the choke points," Kade commanded. "We can't let them spread out." "We extraction better get here soon," Donovan muttered, reloading. "We're running on fumes." The soldiers redoubled their efforts, their weapons barking as they repelled another wave of whistlers. The bugs' persistence was unnerving. Even as their numbers dwindled, they kept coming, their scalpel limbs and oily black shells gleaming in the dim light. Martel glanced at Kade, her face pale but resolute. "They're not retreating," she said, "even with their losses." The dropship's searchlights cut through the darkness, light lancing in through the broken windows, illuminating the floor of the warehouse. The sound of its engines was deafening as it landed just outside, lowering its ramp. Kade motioned to his squad. "Go! Get the wounded aboard first!" The soldiers moved quickly, hauling their injured comrades toward the ramp. Donovan and his squad held the barricades, firing until their rifles clicked empty. When the last injured person was aboard, Donovan turned to Kade. "That's everyone, let's move." The 2 squads retreated up the ramp as the whistlers surged forward one last time. The dropship's guns roared to life, cutting down the advancing swarm in a hail of firepower. The ramp closed, sealing the soldiers inside as the craft ascended. Inside the cabin, the soldiers sat in tense silence, their breathing heavy. Martel clutched the salvaged core of the beacon, her knuckles white. Kade looked out the viewport at the darkened ruins below, his jaw set. "They're not stopping," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. The whistles faded into the distance, but the haunting sound lingered in his mind. The dropship's engines hummed with a comforting, steady rhythm, a stark contrast to the chaos left behind. Its interior was dimly lit, casting shadows across the bloodied and battered soldiers seated along the walls. The air was thick with exhaustion and the metallic tang of scorched armor and sweat. Kade stood near the ramp as it sealed shut, his rifle still clutched in his hands, though the immediate danger was gone. "Move," he ordered sharply, gesturing to 2 soldiers struggling to haul a wounded comrade toward the med bay. His voice, muffled by his helmet, carried an edge of urgency even now. "Get him stabilized!" Donovan leaned against a bulkhead, one gauntlet pressed to his side where his armor was scored and dented. "Relax," he muttered, his usual levity dulled by fatigue. "We're in the air, bugs don't fly, yet." Kade shot him a glare but didn't respond. Instead he turned to Martel, who was crouched on the floor, clutching the salvaged beacon core like a precious relic. Her face was pale, streaked with grime, and her eyes were distant, as if replaying the horrors of the past hour. "Is it intact?" Kade asked, his voice low but insistent. Martel nodded absently. "It's functional, and the data—" She trailed off, swallowing hard. "The data might tell us something. Something new. At least I hope so." The dropship lurched slightly as it gained altitude, the whine of its engines changing pitch. Inside, the soldiers sat in silence. No one spoke of victory. There was none to speak of. The swarm hadn't been stopped. The field wasn't cleared. Most had simply survived, and even that felt tenuous. Kade removed his helmet, revealing a face etched with fatigue and faint scars that seemed deeper in the dim light. He glanced at Donovan, who had slumped into his seat and was staring at the ceiling. "We failed," Kade said finally, breaking the silence. Donovan didn't look at him. "We lived, mostly. That counts for something." They both glanced at the empty seats that had been filled before the mission. Kade nodded reluctantly. His gaze shifted to Martel, who was still cradling the beacon core, Her fingers traced its surface absently, her lips moving as if she were whispering to it, or to herself. The debriefing room at the outpost was sterile and cold, its harsh lights a stark contrast to the dim interior of the dropship. Kade stood stiffly before a panel of officers, Donovan to his right and Martel to his left. The silence between them carried the weight of failure. "The operation didn't achieve its objective," Kade said bluntly. His voice was steady, but the frustration simmered just beneath the surface. "We couldn't hold the field. The beacon drew them in, but they adapted faster than we anticipated." "And when it was deactivated?" one officer prompted. "What happened then?" "They didn't stop," Kade continued. "If anything, they became more aggressive. It's like it made them angry. I've never seen them get angry before." Donovan shifted, his arms crossed. "They're not dumb animals," he added. "They're coordinated, tactical. If we keep treating them like pests, we're going to lose." The officers exchanged uneasy glances before turning to Martel. She placed the beacon core on the table, a series of lights on its side blinking. "The beacon worked," she began, her voice softer than usual, tinged with exhaustion. "It drew them in. But while the mission failed, it taught us something. These creatures aren't just reacting to signals, they're processing them, retaining them, changing them. We know they're intelligent, how they learn so quickly and work together. But how do we disrupt that?" one officer asked. Martel hesitated, then nodded. "Not in the way we understand intelligence. Their bioelectric systems are advanced, far beyond what we initially thought. The effects of the signal lingered after it was deactivated, like it had a mind of its own. Maybe they don't need their bodies to act and think like we do. We have structures to move and live in. Maybe what they really are is that liquid, and that's why all their separate parts can move independently. Like when you cut some types of worms into pieces, each piece can become a new worm. Maybe they are a fluid they pour into a new vessel. It's why they don't seem to care if they get cut to bits. It's not really a problem for them." The room fell silent, the implications sinking in. "What does this mean for future operations?" another officer asked, breaking the quiet. Martel leaned forward, her expression grim. "It means they're learning from us faster than we're learning from them. They're adapting faster than we can strategize. The beacon was a tool, but it might have also been a signal to them that we're escalating this fight." Donovan's voice cut through the tension. "Then we'd better escalate smarter. Next time we bring firepower. If we could just get our hands on it, that is." Kade remained silent, his mind replaying the chaotic retreat, the way the whistlers never stopped coming, their usual patience mostly abandoned. He could still hear their whistles in his head, a relentless alien dirge that refused to fade. Martel glanced at him, then at the beacon's data core, its lights blinking. "We need to examine this data and all of the combat footage. See if we can't make some kind of connection. We might not get many more chances."